The radio crackled once, then died. Command center operators at Bagram Airfield leaned forward in their chairs, fingers hovering over keyboards that suddenly felt useless. Captain Raina Voss had been transmitting updates every 12 minutes like clockwork for the past 4 hours. Then nothing. Just the hollow hiss of dead air across 5 different frequencies. Outside, the Afghan sun beat down on tarmac that shimmered like water, and somewhere beyond the mountain range, an A-10 Thunderbolt was either flying home or burning in a valley that maps couldn't name. The last transmission had been clipped, professional, almost bored. Hawkeye, Viper 2-1, Winchester on 30 Mike. RTB, returned to base. Standard. Clean. Then silence fell like a curtain, and 300 people stopped pretending they weren't worried. Raina Voss wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. She'd flown cargo transports for 6 years before someone noticed she had more flight hours than half the fighter pilots on base, and a gunnery score that made instructors check the paperwork twice. They called her grandma behind her back because she was 34 in a squadron of 26-year-olds, because she asked about maintenance logs, because she didn't drink or brag or pretend the job was anything other than what it was. Flying an ugly, slow, incredibly lethal machine into places where people were trying very hard to kill you. Her call sign was Viper, assigned ironically by a flight lead who thought it was funny to name the quiet one after a snake. She never complained. Never explained that her father had been a herpetologist who died holding a spitting cobra he'd been trying to relocate from a village well. She just flew. The mission had been close air support for a convoy moving through the Kunar Valley. Routine until it wasn't. Taliban fighters had turned a resupply run into an ambush, and Raina's A-10 had been the closest asset with ordnance still loaded. She'd rolled in low, her Gatling gun screaming through 7,000 rounds that turned vehicles into scrap and sent insurgents scrambling into caves they thought were safe. Her wingman had taken small arms fire and diverted early. She'd stayed. Alone. The way she always seemed to end up. Now the base held its breath. Maintenance crews stood on the flight line, watching the sky. Intelligence officers reviewed her last known position. And in the command center, a colonel with 28 years of service stared at the empty radar screen and wondered if he just lost the best pilot no one had bothered to celebrate. The A-10 was never meant to be graceful. Built around a 7-barrel Gatling gun that could fire depleted uranium rounds through tank armor, it looked like something assembled from spare parts and grim determination. Raina loved it the way some people love ugly dogs, fiercely, protectively, with full knowledge that beauty was never the point. The aircraft's titanium bathtub could take hits that would shred other planes. Its engines sat high and separated, designed to keep flying even when one was dead. It flew low and slow on purpose, close enough to see faces, close enough to matter. When she'd first climbed into the cockpit 3 years ago, her instructor had said it was the only plane in the Air Force that loved its pilots back. She'd laughed then. She believed it now. Her last known position had been Grid November Victor 77, a stretch of nothing between 2 ridgelines where the maps showed elevation changes but not the whole truth. Satellite imagery revealed dirt paths, scattered compounds, and the kind of terrain that swallowed helicopters whole. No one flew there without backup. No one stayed there after Winchester, out of ammunition. But Raina's transmission had come from there, and then the silence and now speculation filled the spaces between heartbeats. Had she been hit? Had she punched out? Was she walking through hostile territory with nothing but a sidearm and a radio that clearly wasn't working? The questions multiplied like fractures in glass. The convoy she'd been protecting had made it through. 16 soldiers riding in MRAPs that still had paint on them because her gun runs had kept the enemy's heads down long enough for them to push past the kill zone. The convoy commander, a Marine gunnery sergeant named Ortiz, had tried to raise her on the radio to say thanks. He'd gotten static. He'd tried again. More static. Now he sat in a temporary operations center, writing a report he didn't want to finish because finishing it meant admitting she might not be coming back. What the ground teams didn't know, what the satellite feeds couldn't show, was that Reina's A-10 was still flying. Barely. The airframe shuddered with every movement, metal groaning in frequencies that shouldn't exist. Her right engine was dead, turbine blades shredded by a lucky shot from a Dushka heavy machine gun that had opened up from a cave mouth she'd already cleared, or thought she'd cleared. The hydraulics were failing, which meant every control input required force that made her arms shake. Her canopy had 3 spiderweb cracks from shrapnel that had punched through just above her head, close enough that she'd felt the wind change. And the fuel gauge showed numbers that made no mathematical sense unless there was a hole somewhere she couldn't see, which there probably was. She'd been flying for 43 minutes since the hit. 43 minutes of nursing a dying machine through valleys that wanted to kill her almost as much as the people below. She flew with the stick between her knees when she needed both hands to troubleshoot systems. She flew at 200 feet because lower was safer from missiles and higher meant the single engine couldn't generate enough thrust. The mountains passed beneath her like broken teeth, and she thought about her father calmly explaining that venom was just modified saliva, that fear made it worse, that the snake was just trying to survive. She thought about all the pilots who'd called her careful, cautious, boring. She thought about survival. The radio was dead because the backup battery had caught fire. She'd smothered it with a glove and vented the smoke through the bleed air system, but the damage was done. No transmission meant no rescue coordination, no warning to the base, no confirmation she was even alive. She was a ghost flying a machine that had every reason to fall apart, and the only people who knew were the ones shooting at her from positions she'd already passed. They'd claimed the kill. They'd celebrate tonight. She intended to ruin that celebration by landing. Bagram came into view like a mirage through the haze. The base sprawled across the desert, neat rows of buildings and aircraft that represented order in a place that rejected it. Reina's hands were cramping on the stick, and her fuel showed 100 pounds remaining, which was basically fumes and optimism. The landing gear indicator lights were dark because the electrical system was compromised, which meant she'd be dropping the gear manually, and hopping gravity and mechanical backups did what hydraulics couldn't. She keyed the dead radio out of habit, a muscle memory that meant nothing now, and started her approach. The tower saw her first. A controller named Ramos had been scanning the sky with binoculars every 5 minutes since the silence began. When the dark shape appeared through the smoke, actual smoke trailing from the aircraft like a funeral shroud, he grabbed the radio so fast he knocked over his coffee. His voice cracked when he spoke, years of professional composure fracturing in real time. Every emergency vehicle on base began moving toward the runway. Foam trucks, ambulances, fire suppression units that looked like small tanks. The colonel who'd been watching the radar screen ran outside, which he never did, and stood on the tarmac squinting into the sun. It looked like it had been through a shredder. The right engine nacelle was blackened and torn, hydraulic fluid streaming behind in a pink mist that caught the light. The vertical stabilizer had holes large enough to see through, and the wings showed impact damage that made experienced pilots wince. But the landing gear came down, manually cranked, uneven, but down, and Reina lined up on the runway with the kind of precision that seemed impossible given the circumstances. She didn't waver. Didn't overcorrect. Just flew the broken machine like it was any other day, like she hadn't just survived something that should have killed her 3 times over. She touched down harder than planned, the dead engine side dropping first, sparks shooting from metal scraping concrete. The aircraft skidded, slewed left, then straightened as she worked the rudder pedals and what remained of the brakes. It rolled to a stop 800 feet from where it touched down, smoke pouring from every damaged panel, and for a moment nothing moved. Then the canopy opened manually, the hydraulic assist system as dead as everything else, and Reina Voss climbed out with movements that suggested everything hurt. She stood on the wing, looked at the emergency crews racing toward her, and gave a thumbs up that was equal parts defiance and exhaustion. Someone started clapping. Then everyone was clapping. The maintenance chief reached her first, a master sergeant named Kowalski who'd been working on aircraft since before Reyna was born. He stared at the damage with an expression that cycled through disbelief, horror, and something close to reverence. He walked around the A-10 slowly, touching holes, examining torn metal, shaking his head. When he finally looked up at Reyna, who was sitting on the wing now because standing seemed like too much effort, he said what everyone was thinking. "Ma'am, I don't know how you flew this back." She smiled just a little and said what her father used to say about the dangerous animals he studied. "I just kept it calm and didn't make any sudden moves." It became the quote everyone repeated, the line that showed up in reports and got shared in ready rooms across 3 theaters. But it was the rest of what she said, spoken quietly to Kowalski as medics checked her for injuries she insisted she didn't have, that told the real story. "It wanted to come home, I just helped." The debriefing took 4 hours because no one could quite believe the timeline. Reyna had been hit 67 minutes before landing. She'd flown through contested airspace with no radio, no right engine, failing hydraulics, and a fuel leak that should have forced an ejection within 10 minutes. She'd navigated by landmarks and dead reckoning through mountains that swallowed GPS signals. And she'd done it without calling for help, without panic, without any of the drama that usually accompanied emergency situations. The intelligence officers wanted to know about enemy positions. The flight surgeons wanted to know about her physical state. The colonel just wanted to know how she'd stayed so calm. She gave precise answers to the tactical questions and shrugged at the personal ones. What was she supposed to say? That panic was a luxury single-engine aircraft didn't allow. That her father had taught her fear was just information poorly processed. That she'd been too busy flying to worry about dying. The story spread through the base that night, then through the entire theater, then beyond. Pilots talked about it in ready rooms from Kandahar to Kuwait. Maintenance crews used it as an example when teaching young airmen about the A-10's toughness. Someone leaked the gun camera footage showing her final attack run, the one right before she was hit, and the way she'd rolled in low enough to draw fire away from the convoy. The video showed tracer rounds arcing toward her aircraft, showed the muzzle flash of the Dushka that got the lucky shot, showed her pulling up and away with smoke already streaming. It showed competence under fire, the kind that looked easy because it was anything but. Within a week, the young pilots who'd called her grandma started using her call sign with respect. Viper, the one who survived. But respect was complicated when you didn't want it. Reyna had never asked for attention. She flew missions, wrote reports, and spent her downtime reading or running the perimeter fence line where she could think. The sudden interest felt invasive, like people were studying her for secrets she didn't possess. Officers she'd never met wanted to shake her hand. Journalists embedded with the units asked for interviews she declined. A general visiting from Qatar made her stand during a briefing so people could applaud, and she'd hated every second, face burning while people clapped at her for not dying. She understood survival wasn't heroism. It was just successful problem-solving under terrible conditions. Her A-10 had done most of the work anyway, absorbing damage that would have doomed prettier aircraft. She was just the one who'd trusted it enough to keep flying. The real story, the one she told herself during the 3 nights after the incident when sleep wouldn't come, was simpler and harder. She'd been terrified. Not during the flight, there hadn't been time, but after, when the adrenaline faded and she understood how many things had almost gone wrong. The engine could have exploded instead of just dying. The fuel leak could have sparked. The control surfaces could have jammed instead of just becoming stiff. She'd survived because of margin, that tiny space between disaster and success that military aviation tried to maximize but could never guarantee. 100 small decisions had kept her alive, but so had luck, and luck wasn't something you could train or plan for. That knowledge sat heavy in her chest, made her check systems twice before every flight, made her even more careful than before. Ortiz, the Marine gunnery sergeant whose convoy she'd saved, found her 2 weeks later. He tracked her down at the far end of the flight line where she was doing a pre-flight inspection with unusual thoroughness. He waited until she finished, respectful of the ritual, then approached with the careful body language of someone who understood not everyone wanted thanks. He told her his Marines had made it home because she'd stayed. He told her about the corporal who would have been right in the kill zone if she hadn't made that final gun run, the one that got her hit. He told her the corporal had a daughter who was 3 years old and liked dinosaurs. Then he left before she could deflect or minimize, just shook her hand and walked away. She stood there for 5 minutes afterward, staring at the A-10, thinking about chain reactions and consequences and the weight of decisions made in seconds. The aircraft had been repaired, though repaired was generous. Maintenance had replaced the engine, patched the holes, and declared it airworthy by standards that would have grounded civilian aircraft forever. Kowalski personally oversaw every repair, documenting the damage with photographs that would end up in training manuals. When he finally signed off on the work, he'd added a note in the logbook. This aircraft refused to quit, like the pilot. Raina saw it during her pre-flight and felt something crack in her chest, some barrier between who she was and who everyone thought she was. Maybe it was okay to be both. Maybe the woman who checked maintenance logs obsessively and the pilot who'd flown a dying machine through a mountain range were the same person, just viewed from different angles. She flew the next day, a standard patrol that felt anything but standard. Every sound made her hyper-aware. Every instrument reading demanded triple checking. The A-10 handled differently, or maybe she handled differently, more conscious of the partnership between pilot and machine. The sky was clear, operations routine, but she felt the vulnerability now. Understood that the armor worked until it didn't, that systems had backups until the backups failed, that survival required both skill and grace from forces she couldn't control. She landed with fuel to spare and systems nominal, and realized she'd been holding her breath. The weeks became months. The incident faded into base history, replaced by new emergencies and achievements. Raina flew missions, trained new pilots, and slowly accepted that her definition of herself didn't have to match everyone else's. The younger pilots watched how she pre-flighted aircraft and started doing the same. They asked questions about tactics and she answered honestly, including the parts where she'd been scared or uncertain. She taught them that competence wasn't fearlessness. It was being afraid and flying anyway, being uncertain and making decisions anyway, being tired and focusing anyway. The lessons seemed to land deeper than the usual bravado-filled briefings. One afternoon, 6 months after the incident, she found an envelope in her locker. No return address, just her name in careful handwriting. Inside was a child's drawing of a dinosaur and a note from Ortiz's corporal. His daughter had drawn it. The note said "Thank you" in crayon. Raina taped it inside her helmet bag where she'd see it before every flight, a reminder that missions weren't abstractions. They had faces, families, futures that extended beyond tactical objectives. The weight of that responsibility could have been crushing. Instead, it clarified everything. She wasn't flying to prove anything. She was flying because people needed someone who cared enough to come back. Her last deployment came 2 years later. By then, she was an instructor, tasked with teaching the next generation of A-10 pilots how to survive in aircraft that were older than their grandparents. She taught them the technical aspects, energy management, weapons employment, battle damage assessment. But she also taught them the intangibles: how to stay calm when systems failed, how to trust the machine and yourself simultaneously, how to make decisions with incomplete information and live with the consequences. The students called her tough but fair, demanding but patient. They didn't call her grandma anymore. Just Viper, said with the kind of respect that didn't need explanation. On her final flight, she took up the same A-10 she'd nearly died in. Maintenance had wanted to retire it 3 times, but Kowalski kept finding reasons to keep it flying. It bore her name below the canopy now, painted there by crew chiefs who'd never met a pilot they respected more. She flew it through valleys she recognized, over terrain that still held memories of fear and adrenaline and stubborn refusal to quit. The sky was the same endless blue she'd first seen when her father took her to a field to watch a coach whip snake move. He'd said the snake was beautiful not despite being dangerous, but because of it. That survival and grace weren't opposites. That the world needed people who understood both. She'd been 8 years old, watching the snake flow through grass like water and hadn't understood. Now she did. She landed as the sun set, golden light painting the runway the color of memory. The crew chiefs gave her a water salute, two fire trucks spraying arcs that caught the light and turned into rainbows. Pilots lined the taxiway, dozens of them, young and old, forming an informal honor guard for someone who'd never sought honor. She shut down the engines for the last time, listening to the turbines spool down into silence. Then she climbed out, stood on the wing, and looked at all those faces. Saw herself reflected in them, the careful ones, the bold ones, the ones who flew because someone had to and it might as well be them. She didn't give a speech, just saluted, jumped down from the wing with knees that reminded her she wasn't 26 anymore, and walked away from the flight line for the last time. Years later, when investigators studied her career for patterns that might explain excellence, they found something unexpected. Every mission had been logged with unusual detail, every maintenance issue documented, every risk calculated not for glory but for the people depending on her. Excellence wasn't dramatic. It was hundreds of small decisions made correctly, repeatedly, without recognition. It was flying when scared, landing when tired, caring when it would have been easier not to. The investigators wrote reports that tried to quantify what made pilots like Raina Voss effective. They missed the essential part. She'd never tried to be a hero. She just tried to come home, and in doing that simple, impossible thing, she'd shown everyone else how. The base lost contact for hours that day, but the A-10 had crawled home through the smoke, carrying a pilot who understood what her father had tried to teach her about dangerous things. That fear was just information. That survival required respect for both the danger and your ability to face it. That sometimes the most important thing wasn't how fast you flew or how bold you were, but whether you cared enough to keep flying when everything argued for quitting. Raina Voss had cared. The machine had responded, and somewhere in the space between those two facts lived something worth remembering, competence forged in silence, tested by fire, and measured not in medals but in people who made it home because someone flew the mission right. The sky held her legacy now, invisible but permanent, written in contrails that faded but never disappeared completely. Just like venom was modified saliva, heroism was modified duty. Her father would have understood. The snake had been beautiful because it survived, so had she. That was enough.